Thank you, Denise, for the great introduction. Like she said, I'm Alex Fries. I'm a relatively new cartographer at the National Park Service's Harpers Ferry Center for Media Development, where we oversee the design and production of interpretive products across the entire agency. And our mission includes overseeing the protection of interpretation of places with deep cultural or historical importance to our country. And so with that in mind today, I want to chat with you all about just one of these projects that kind of encapsulates that mission, and of course, doing so with maps. So the project in question is a new visitor's brochure for Raisin National Battlefield Park. And don't feel bad if you've never heard of it before, because I had never heard of it before until I got this project. This park is located in the heart of Monroe, Michigan, which is a small city wedged halfway between Detroit and Toledo. It's one of the newer parks in the NPS system, only established in 2009 via an act of Congress, and it commemorates what is almost certainly one of the most important battlefield sites related to the War of 1812. But what exactly makes it so important and worth preserving? And so to understand the importance of the battle at Raisin, which is shown in this painting right here, we have to consider the context which led up to and ultimately resulted from the battle. When the War of 1812 broke out, the theater of war in which it was fought in what we might call the Old Northwest, it was drastically different than it was in other parts of the United States. It was largely this continuation of a decades-long conflict between the native peoples living in what would become the Michigan Territory and the white settlers who were encroaching upon their lands. And the Battle of Raisin sort of represents a high point of Native American success in resisting against that white encroachment. In this battle, which took place on January 22nd, 1813, the native forces and their British allies so badly beat the Americans here that out of a force of 1,000 U.S. soldiers and Kentucky militiamen, only 33 managed to escape, making this by far the most costly battle for the war, for the United States in terms of casualties during the war. Yet the battle actually proved to be disastrous for the Native Americans in the long run. In the short term, the battle was used as a sort of bolstering for the war effort and military recruitment, so much so that the phrase, "remember the raisin," became this sort of rallying cry for American troops on the battlefield. And in the long run, the battle was used as sort of the chief catalyst behind the efforts to push for Indian removal in the Michigan Territory and in turn, eventually, all of the United States. But keeping that wider significance of the battle in mind, then, it's important that our new park brochure illustrates that wider significance, of an event that took place in an otherwise very small part of Michigan. And as you saw in the previous painting, the battlefield itself occupied a very, very small area. And so I'm showing this map here as kind of an example of the typical map you might see that, describes where this battle took place. And it's fine and forgiving, just the general location of where it happened, but it doesn't do much else. It doesn't explain the context of the area as it existed back then. And it's kind of anachronistic. It shows present-day county boundaries. It shows cities that didn't exist back then, like Toledo and Monroe itself. So with that in mind, my goal was to make a map that recreates the landscape of the past, both physically and culturally, as faithfully as possible, so that the story of Raisin could be retold in its proper geographic framing. And so this is the sort of map that we've come up with so far. And full disclosure, this is an extremely early draft. Things are very much subject to change on it. But as it stands right now, we've gone for the sort of high oblique view that shows the western shore of Lake Erie as it might have appeared during the war. Maybe the most striking thing on this map is the land cover that's shown on here. And land cover, of course, played a remarkable role in the Raisin story, dictating, for example, why the involved armies made this various tactical or strategic movements that they did. But obviously the land cover of the time is drastically different from what we might see today in Michigan and Ohio and Ontario. So I couldn't use Landsat or Sentinel to make this data set. So what did I use? It turns out there's actually various data sets available for just this sort of mapping. Michigan has a very detailed statewide data set that was developed at Michigan State University, and it was created in part based on the field notes that were derived during the U.S.'s original efforts to survey the state in the early 19th century. And Ohio has a similar data set. It's much coarser in scale, and it uses much older data and maps. But in fact, it's more scale appropriate for the map I'm trying to make. And so I then went back to the Michigan data, and I had to manually consolidate it and edit it to make it line up with the Ohio stuff, essentially. And then there's that small sliver of Ontario that appears on the map, and unfortunately, at least I wasn't able to find any data sets with the same sort of precision that I needed for this project. So my solution, if you will, was to rely on Essex County, Ontario's soil survey information instead, and I used that to kind of guesstimate, if you will, what the natural vegetation of the county might have looked like prior to widespread European settlement. Now, a subtler but still more important data set on this map is the one that shows the shoreline of Lake Erie as it was in the 1810s. So believe it or not, the water levels of Lake Erie and actually all of the Great Lakes in the 1810s was noticeably lower. His estimates, I think, had them as much as 6 feet lower than they are today. And that doesn't make a huge difference in some places, but in other places like in marshlands or otherwise low-lying areas, it can make a pretty remarkable change on the landscape, especially here. This is the delta of the River Raisin, for example. And so my solution for reconstructing that historical coastline was to just georeference the original survey plats that the U.S. General Land Office produced in the early through mid-19th century. And these are relatively easy to georeference as far as 19th century maps go, thanks to the Public Land Survey System grid. Now the delta of the River Raisin I'm using as the example here, because not only was the change due to natural causes very striking, but also because of the various human modifications that have been made to the river delta over time. And these are things I don't want showing up on a map that's supposed to represent 1812. And in total, I ended up georeferencing about 17 different plat maps, and these were derived from a variety of sources, not just federal archives, but sometimes I had to call state or even local authorities to get the maps that would be useful for me, as well as 5 different survey maps for Essex County, Ontario. And you might have noticed if you're looking at the map, there's a lot of place names that are on the map, and I chose to put the names on there as they might have been known to people during the 1810s. Some name changes, reflected on the map then versus how we know them today. There might just be variations in spelling and or pronunciation. Others are translations over time from maybe the original French to how we know them now, English. And then there's some names that just don't, they're not even close to the same. And I'm also going to lump in this category the features that are labeled on the maps that you might not be familiar with because they don't exist anymore. And some of these features are important, like the Great Black Swamp is arguably one of the most important features on this entire map. And so a lot of research going into just those sorts of features as well. And on a related note, of course, is the research that I put into showcasing the cultural and human footprint on the region, specifically in the major populated places that appeared at the time of the battle. And one thing I absolutely want this map to do is push against this notion that the Michigan Territory was some sort of empty, devoid of human life wilderness, right? This is an area that was heavily populated by native peoples. They far outnumbered the European settlers at the time of the battle, and this map needs to demonstrate that. At the same time, though, the European presence was definitely here. This had become a crossroads for native and European interaction at this point. And so I did a lot of research into those villages as well. The city of Detroit and the village of Frenchtown where the battle took place were not the only places where Europeans had left their mark. So a lot of this information I gathered from this Atlas of Great Lake Indian History. The park themselves recommended this source for me. A fantastic piece of information that use extensive archaeological data to map out Native American history throughout the entire Great Lake region, and not just during the War of 1812, but over the course of their entire inhabitation of the region. And so continuing on with that theme that I mentioned earlier, showing the impact that Native Americans had on this land, this map also shows some of the major trails that they had developed by this time. And these trails, of course, are not restricted to just this region. This was part of a much wider, more interconnected network of roads and trails that extended as far down as the Gulf of Mexico and as far east as the coast of New England. And for this map specifically, though, my primary source for determining these trails' routes was an archaeological atlas of Michigan that was published in 1931. But to my knowledge, it still remains one of, if not the best source, relating to geographic information about the original inhabitants of Michigan. And the trails shown on the original map, I chose carefully based on the trails that are actually present on maps that were produced in the time period. So they, this demonstrate to me that they were very much in use at that point. And that said, there is one road that I omitted from the previous slides, and it's arguably the most important one in this entire project. So it's not showing up that well, but I highlight above there was an existing native trail that followed the western shore of Lake Erie that was essentially widened and improved by the U.S. government in the early 1810s. And today we refer to this road as Hull's Trace, and it was named for the Army of U.S. General William Hull. That they had a significant role in ensuring the completion of this road. They actually improved it on their way up to the city of Detroit in the opening stages of the war when they tried very unsuccessfully to conquer Upper Canada. And this road is crucial to the River Raisin story, though, because it was the only route available for American troops to use at the time, or at the start of the war, back when the British still had naval control of Lake Erie. And so when it was captured by the native British alliance early in the war, General Hull essentially surrendered the city of Detroit, rather infamously, in part due to the loss of this road. And the surrender of Detroit is the main catalyst that leads to the events of River Raisin. And so, believe it or not, there is a piece of the original Hull's Trace that still exists today. There's a row of about 600 logs that spans about 1,000 feet sitting along this embankment on the Huron River. And these are remnants of the corduroy road that research shows was built by Hull's army in 1812 to help stabilize the floodplain's marshy ground for easier movement of troops and equipment across the river plain. Or was it? I pose that question because while working on this project, I came across some evidence that suggests to me that those logs may not have actually been placed there in 1812. And so I need to take a step back for a second, because amazingly, we actually have access to the original field notes and the original map that was produced during the initial survey of the road in 1809. It was just sitting untouched in the Detroit Library archives for decades, recently rediscovered essentially. This document was the single thing that made it possible to map Hull's Trace with any sort of accuracy whatsoever. And all you needed to know was where the road started and where it ended, and then you could use that information essentially to plot the road using distance and bearing readings that are listed on the side. Now, in the upper portion of the map here, we see this little note that indicates the road crossed the Huron River via ferry, specifically one operated by a French individual named Gabriel Godfrey. And we can be sure he owned this ferry on the lower Huron River, thanks to land claim documents which attest to as much. And we're able to further pinpoint where this river crossing would have been, thanks to the fact that his land claim on the river is clearly shown on several maps from the period. And in fact, it remains today within the official PLSS grid system in Wayne County, Michigan. And you notice, too, how his French long lot is bound on the southwest by a particular bend in the Huron River. And then we have an additional map that was produced after the war in 1817 that shows the road crossing the Huron River at this very same bend, and specifically there was a river crossing on a ferry, although it's upside down here. And we also have the official public land survey system map showing the road going through that same river bend on his property. And so today, that bend of the river is actually submerged under Lake Erie now. Remember what I said about the lake levels have risen substantially over time. But that original land claim boundary still has that bend in the river as one of its defining features, which leads us to a problem then, because the corduroy road remnants are about 1,000 feet away to the west from where they're supposed to be. Now, based on the maps and data we have available to us, I surmise that the road probably should have been here instead, which on the surface of things, it's not a substantial difference, but I was actually surprised to see that this small difference in the route does appear even on my little draft map. It's going to be on a tiny little piece of paper, but it still showed up, and I'm like, okay. And of course, the implications go far beyond just a little park brochure map, because the park itself has been interested for a while now in possibly purchasing the land that this road is on for preservation and interpretation. Do these facts change their plans potentially? And if the road remnants that are found in this position today are in the wrong place, what does that mean? Were the original logs that were placed by William Hull's army in 1812 moved to their present location at some point? Or were those original logs just abandoned altogether, submerged under the lake, and then, this route has absolutely no relation to it? And ultimately, I'm not sure. That's probably not my place to make that call. But my takeaway really is just that, sometimes when you're doing this sort of research in mapping, you don't know what roads the data and the research are going to take you down. And I'll leave you all with that. This project's been incredibly fun to work on. And